The nights end so differently from how they began that a man never quite trusts a calm evening again for the rest of his life. And for Nathan Vance, that particular night started with nothing more dramatic than a business meeting that fell apart 3 hours earlier than planned. He sat in the back of his car as it moved through wet, empty streets, jaw tight, mind still replaying the conversation that had gone wrong. The kind of wrong that meant money lost and trust tested among men who rarely forgave either. He hadn't expected to be home before midnight. Instead, his headlights swept across the gravel drive of his estate a little after 9, rain just beginning to fall in thin, scattered drops against the windshield, and the house ahead of him sat dark and still, exactly the way he'd left it that morning. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. He stepped out of the car into air that smelled like rain on warm pavement, the kind of smell that usually settled him after a hard day. And he might have gone straight inside, without noticing anything unusual at all if his eyes hadn't caught a single detail out of place at the far edge of the property. A light was on in the old carriage house, a small structure near the back fence that had sat locked and untouched for years, ever since his late wife Claire used to keep her gardening tools there before illness took her from him far too young. No one had reason to be in that building. No one had a key to it besides Nathan himself, and the staff who had worked in that house long enough to remember Claire at all. His first thought was simple and immediate, the kind of thought that came instinctively to a man who had spent 20 years building an organization that made him more enemies than most people accumulate in a lifetime. Someone had gotten onto his property, and whoever they were currently standing inside a building they had no business being in. He moved across the gravel slowly, deliberately, rain now falling steadily enough to soak through the shoulders of his coat, his hand drifting without thought to the weapon he kept holstered at his hip, a motion so practiced it barely registered as a decision at all. The closer he came to that small structure, the more his mind ran through possibilities. A rival sending a message, a desperate thief who had chosen badly, or something worse, something planned specifically to be discovered by him and no one else. What Nathan Vance found when he finally reached that window was not a threat waiting to strike, and it was nothing close to anything his 20 years in this life had prepared him to expect. Through the rain-streaked glass, in the soft, warm light of a single lamp, he saw his housekeeper, Eleanor Hayes, kneeling on the floor of that old carriage house beside a young woman whose face was bruised badly enough to make Nathan's chest tighten instantly. Watching Eleanor clean the wound with the calm, unhurried patience of someone who had done exactly this many times before, speaking to the frightened girl in a low, steady voice he had never once heard her use in 6 years of quiet, ordinary conversations in his kitchen. Behind them, along the far wall, 2 more women sat huddled on simple cots, watching the scene with the wary stillness of people who had learned, the hard way, never to trust silence completely. Nathan stood frozen in the rain outside that window for what felt like a very long time, his hand still resting on the weapon at his hip, though the instinct to use it had drained out of him completely the moment his eyes adjusted to what he was actually seeing inside. He had spent 2 decades building a name that made grown men lower their voices when they said it. A house so thoroughly under his control that nothing happened within its walls or across its grounds without his knowledge or his permission. And yet here, in a forgotten building at the edge of his own property, his maid had quietly built something he had never known existed, something that looked, in that soft lamplight, less like a secret and more like the safest place any of those 3 frightened women had probably known in a very long time. He had absolutely no idea, standing there soaked to the skin with rain running down the back of his collar, that the woman kneeling on that floor was about to explain to him a truth that would force him to look at his entire life, and everyone in it, in a way he had never once allowed himself to before. Nathan pushed open the carriage house door without knocking, rain still dripping from his coat onto the wooden floor, and the room went still the instant he stepped inside. Eleanor rose slowly to her feet, not with the panic of someone caught in wrongdoing, but with the composed, deliberate calm of a woman who had clearly imagined this exact moment more than once and had long since decided how she would handle it if it ever came. The young woman on the floor flinched hard at the sight of him, pulling back instinctively against the wall, and that single flinch struck Nathan harder than any confrontation he'd faced in years, because he understood immediately, without needing to be told, exactly what kind of fear lived behind it. Eleanor did not apologize, did not scramble for an explanation, did not treat him the way most people in his world treated him when caught doing something they shouldn't. She simply looked at him steadily and said that he should sit down, because what she had to tell him was going to take a while, and none of it was going to be easy for either of them to hear. To understand how Nathan Vance ended up standing rain-soaked in a carriage house, discovering a secret his own household had kept from him for the better part of a year, you have to understand the man he had become in the 8 years since his father's death placed the full weight of the family's operations onto his shoulders. Nathan had never wanted the life he inherited, but wanting had very little to do with obligation in a family like his, and by the time he was 40, he had built a reputation for control so absolute that few people, inside the organization or outside it, ever tested the boundaries of his authority twice. What almost no one outside his own home ever saw was the version of Nathan that existed alongside his wife, Claire, a schoolteacher with an easy laugh and an unshakable refusal to let his work define the man she fell in love with, a woman who had spent a decade gently reminding him that strength and gentleness were never actually opposites, no matter what his father had taught him to believe. Claire's death 4 years earlier, after a long illness that Nathan still could not discuss without his voice changing, had left him hollowed out in a way his organization never witnessed because he simply refused to let them, burying every ounce of that grief beneath an even more rigid, controlled version of himself. Eleanor Hayes had come into his household 18 months after Claire's passing, hired initially through a staffing agency to manage a home that had begun slipping into quiet disorder, and within months she had become something far more essential than her job title suggested. The only person who could reliably get Nathan to eat a proper dinner or laugh, even briefly, at something that had nothing to do with business. There had been small details along the way that Nathan noticed, but never fully questioned. Evenings when Eleanor left the estate without explanation and returned hours later looking tired in a way housework alone never seemed to cause. A locked cabinet in the mudroom stocked with medical supplies far beyond what any household typically required, and a particular gentleness she showed toward the youngest, most nervous women hired onto the household staff, a gentleness that always seemed to carry more weight than simple kindness. None of it had ever added up to something Nathan felt compelled to investigate, because grief, in his experience, made people quietly build whatever private rituals helped them survive it, and Eleanor's occasional absences had never once interfered with the smooth, careful way she ran his home. It was only standing in that carriage house, rain still clinging to his shoulders, that every one of those small, previously unremarkable details suddenly rearranged themselves into a pattern Nathan had never once thought to look for. The events that led to this moment had actually begun taking shape weeks earlier, when Nathan's younger brother Dominic, restless under the weight of Nathan's cautious leadership and hungry for a larger share of control within the organization, began quietly pursuing a business arrangement Nathan had explicitly rejected months before. The supplier Dominic had reconnected with carried a reputation that extended well beyond simple criminal enterprise. A man known among those familiar with his operations for treating the women in his employ with a level of violence that even hardened men in Nathan's world considered beyond acceptable. When Nathan learned of the renewed contact and confronted his brother directly, Dominic deflected with the practiced ease of a man who had prepared his justification in advance, insisting that profit margins mattered more than reputations, and that Nathan's caution, however well-intentioned, was costing the family opportunities they could not afford to keep passing up. Around this same time, though Nathan had no knowledge of it yet, a frightened young woman arrived at the carriage house late one night. Delivered quietly through a network of contacts Eleanor had spent nearly a year carefully building, her face marked with bruises that told their own story before she ever said a single word. In a moment of exhausted, trembling honesty, the young woman mentioned that her boyfriend worked for the Vances, a detail that landed on Eleanor with a weight she carefully kept from showing on her face, understanding immediately just how close this particular secret had suddenly come to the very family she served. The danger of that closeness became real only days later, when the man responsible for that young woman's injuries, one of Dominic's own men, traced her movements as far as the outer edge of the Vance estate, forcing Eleanor into a tense, urgent scramble to relocate her to a safer location before he ever discovered exactly where she had gone. Dominic, sensing something being carefully hidden from him without yet understanding what, began quietly investigating Eleanor's background on his own, hoping to uncover something he could use as leverage, some crack in her position that would finally convince Nathan to see her as replaceable rather than essential. It was this same rising tension, layered quietly beneath the surface of Nathan's household, that made his early return home that rainy night feel almost inevitable, one hidden world colliding unexpectedly with another in the space of a single unplanned evening. Sitting now across from Eleanor in the carriage house, the rain finally settling into a steady rhythm against the roof above them, Nathan listened as she explained plainly that she had been quietly running this shelter for nearly a year, using her own savings and a network of contacts from a part of her life she had never once discussed with him, taking in women who had nowhere else safe left to turn. She admitted, without flinching, that several of those women had connections, direct or indirect, to men within his own organization, a fact she had known would eventually complicate everything, but one she had decided, deliberately, was worth the risk of complicating. Nathan sat in silence through most of it, torn between a rising anger at having something this significant hidden inside his own home for so long, and a slower, more uncomfortable recognition of exactly why Eleanor had never felt she could simply ask his permission. That fragile, uneasy silence between them was broken by the sound of a car pulling hard onto the gravel outside, headlights sweeping briefly across the carriage house windows before cutting off entirely. Dominic emerged from the vehicle already talking before he'd even reached the door, his own investigation having led him, that same evening, to the exact same discovery Nathan had just stumbled into by accident. The moment he stepped inside and recognized one of the women on the cots as connected to his own men, his expression shifted from suspicion into something colder, more urgent, immediately demanding that Nathan shut the entire operation down before it exposed the family to risks neither of them could fully control. It was in the middle of that heated exchange, with Dominic's voice rising and Nathan caught between loyalty to his brother and the accumulating weight of everything Eleanor had just revealed, that Eleanor finally told them both the truth she had carried privately for far longer than either man could have guessed. Years before she had ever stepped foot in Nathan's household, her own daughter had become involved with a man tied to organized crime in another city, a relationship that Eleanor had watched grow increasingly dangerous from a distance, powerless to intervene until it was already far too late. She had arrived, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the visible effort it cost her, only after the violence had already taken her daughter's life, a loss that reshaped everything about who Eleanor became afterward, including a private, unshakable vow to spend the rest of her life making sure other women never faced that same violence utterly alone. That single revelation reframed everything Nathan had witnessed and questioned about Eleanor over the past 6 years, her calm competence under pressure, her carefully guarded evenings away, the locked cabinet stocked exactly for moments like this one, and her specific, deliberate warmth toward every anxious young woman who had ever come to work in that house. But it also produced a reaction from Dominic that neither Nathan nor Eleanor expected, his face draining of color the instant Eleanor named the man responsible for her daughter's death years earlier, a name Dominic clearly recognized immediately, because it belonged to the very network he had spent recent weeks quietly rebuilding business ties with for the sake of profit margins he had insisted mattered more than caution. Nathan turned slowly to look at his brother in that moment, understanding with sudden, sickening clarity exactly what kind of people Dominic had chosen to protect for the sake of the family's bottom line, and something in him hardened into a resolve entirely separate from the fury he had originally walked into that carriage house carrying. 2 days later, he called an emergency meeting of the organization's senior members, laying out in careful, deliberate detail exactly who Dominic's new supplier connections actually were, and exactly what kind of violence those connections had already been responsible for, including, though he did not need to spell it out fully, the destruction of the very family standing quietly beside him in that room. Dominic's justifications collapsed quickly under the weight of what was being revealed, his arguments about necessary hard choices sounding increasingly hollow against Eleanor's steady, unwavering account of exactly what those hard choices had already cost one mother, one daughter, one family that would never be whole again. For a tense, uncertain moment, the room held its breath, every man present understanding that a confrontation this significant could easily tip toward the kind of violent resolution their world usually demanded from moments like this one. But Nathan, standing beside Eleanor with a clarity he had not felt in years, chose differently, formally severing every tie to the supplier network Dominic had aligned himself with, and stripping his brother of authority over that entire side of the business immediately, and without room for negotiation. Rather than treating Eleanor's shelter as a liability to be quietly dismantled, he did something none of the men in that room expected, publicly placing the estate's resources and protection behind it, transforming what had spent nearly a year existing in secrecy into something the family would now openly shield rather than merely tolerate. Months passed after that tense, rain-soaked confrontation, and the old carriage house at the back of the Vance estate slowly transformed alongside the rest of that household, renovated carefully into a proper, secure space no longer hidden behind locked doors and quiet excuses, but staffed and funded openly. A small plaque near its entrance bearing a dedication to the daughter Eleanor had lost so many years before. Nathan, changed in ways that ran far deeper than a single difficult conversation, began quietly redirecting pieces of his influence toward protection rather than pure control, understanding at last something Claire had spent years gently trying to teach him. That real strength had never been about how completely a man could dominate the people around him, but about how much he was willing to risk protecting the ones who had none of his power at all. On a quiet evening several months later, Nathan found himself standing at that same carriage house window where he had once stood soaked in rain with his hand resting instinctively on a weapon, watching now as Eleanor knelt beside a newly arrived young woman, speaking to her in that same low, steady voice, teaching her simply how to breathe through fear that had not yet begun to loosen its grip. The porch light glowed warm against the evening now instead of casting the suspicious shadows it once had, and Nathan understood, watching that familiar scene unfold in front of him, that the most unbelievable thing he had found in his own home that stormy night hadn't been a secret being kept from him at all. It had been the quiet, unshakable courage of a woman who had turned her deepest grief into someone else's safety. Courage that an empire built on 20 years of fear had never once managed to offer anyone, until the night Nathan Vance came home early and finally learned what real protection actually looked like.